Hello and welcome to Elder Interviews, a new program from Creation and Spirituality Communities, where we explore the lives and experiences of our creation spirituality elders, women and men whose spirits shine with the hard-won wisdom of the sage. My name is Gail Ransom, and I am delighted to be your host for this third session of our fall series. I will be conducting the question and answers after the interview, when you are invited to get involved. Please write down anything that comes to mind while you are listening. It is also my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Penny Andrews, who will conduct the interview with our guest today, Larry Edwards. Penny has a D.Min. from the University of Creation Spirituality and also is ordained through the Chaplaincy Institute. She now leads services 4 times a year for the last Free Thought Congregation in America, which is in Madison, Wisconsin, and is studying the inner work and the right brain response to the powers of the universe with Brian Swimme. Penny never stops learning and never stops giving, and I'm very pleased to be doing this with her today. Penny.
Thanks, Gail. Well, it's been my pleasure to get to know Larry Edwards in preparation for this. And just by way of a bio for Larry, I'm using Gail's words. Larry has imparted reverence for the sacred story of the universe and its dynamics to students of creation spirituality through reason, ritual, dance, and awe. He was educated as a chemical physicist at Harvard University, from which he received his PhD. Over the years, he has presented the universe story as our sacred creation story in a variety of settings, from purely academic to religious and spiritual centers. University of Creation Spirituality, Miami-Dade College, Genesis Farm, Earth Literacy Center, the Dominican Eco Center in Wicklow, Ireland. His presentations emphasize that a new context is necessary to fully answer the ancient questions of who am I and where do I come from? Well, with that, I'd like to introduce Larry Edwards. And Larry? I wondered if you were talking about having a reading for us. I wondered if you were able to bring that forward.
Okay. You'll be surprised. The book I chose, it's called Dream of the Earth by Thomas Berry. And this has got to be my most favorite passage. I have used it for every seminar I've ever given, I think. So some of you have heard this before. But it's page 123 of Dream of the Earth, and the chapter is called The New Story. The Dream of the Earth was published, I think, in 1988. It's written by Thomas Berry and Brian Swimme. It took them 10 years. And it was rewritten several times, but one rewrite was essentially the whole book. So they put a lot of effort into this, and I have found it to be magical. As a matter of fact, it's the reason I became interested in the universe story, was reading this book. So here goes. It's a paragraph, so it's a little long. And you really... I can't do it the way Thomas does it. Thomas has this way of, the first sentence is, it's all a question of story. But the way Thomas would say it is, it's all a question of story. We are in trouble right now because we do not have a good story. We are in between stories. The old story, the account of how the world came to be and how we fit into it, is no longer effective. Yet, we have not learned the new story. Our traditional story of the universe sustained us for a long period of time. It shaped our emotional attitudes. It provided us with life purposes and energized action. It consecrated suffering and integrated knowledge. I have to say that's my most favorite sentence of all time. I try to think, how does a person think of such a beautiful, accurate, deep statement? It just never fails to impress me when I read that one sentence. It consecrated suffering and integrated knowledge. We awoke in the morning and knew where we were. We could answer the questions of our children. We could identify crime, punish transgressors. Everything was taken care of because the story was there. It did not necessarily make people good, nor did it take away the pains and stupidities of life, or make for unfailing warmth in human association. It did provide a context in which life could function in a meaningful manner. That was the paragraph that started me, my second career.
Oh, it's beautiful. Yes. Can you talk a little bit, because it is almost like your life has this division point.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about the formative first half, and then in what in that had you open to that paragraph in that book to the second half?
Okay, well, the halves, it was more like 2/3 and 1/3, if we're going to be really precise, because I was about 50 years old, I think, when the second half, the third started. But I got another quarter left, so it's still okay. It was sort of a quick thing and a slow thing, but see, Thomas's point in his book, Dream of the Earth, Thomas was a cultural historian, which means he was not a theologian. That's why he escaped the Vatican for so many years. He was not an official theologian. He studied cultures, and the way he presented this in the book Dream of the Earth, buried in there was that a culture is, in a sense, a choice, a long time choice of a people over centuries or millennia. But it's something that people put together so that life can function in a meaningful manner. That was his message as I picked it up. Now, in my first half of my life, which was as a scientist, middle-class parents in Los Angeles. When I was 19, I left college for a year and I went to Europe, the great hero's journey it was supposed to be. And it was a critical time for me because I realized 1 year in France and Germany that other people think differently than us Americans. Now that doesn't, nowadays, I don't know, that doesn't sound like so much now when I say it out loud, but when I was 19, that was a big deal. And I decided to find out how the French, in particular, I lived in Paris, how they thought. Why did they think the way they do, let's say. So I refused to speak English, and I spoke only French, very poorly at first. I'd had 1 year of French in school. And I just immersed myself in French culture, which amounted to basketball and going to a preparatory science class at the Sorbonne. What I learned was there's another way of looking at the world. And I realized that when I came back home, I went back to school, went back to undergraduate school, I realized that most of the people, most of my friends simply haven't experienced that. They don't know that there's something else. They're still living in the culture that I grew up in, and I'm still in, effectively. but they don't know how to question it. They don't know how to say, well, this is one way of doing business, but it's not the only way. They couldn't say that. They couldn't. So I kind of stumbled a bit. I made a few, my friends had to tell me to, lay off the preaching and, get back in the groove of things, which I did for many years. So that was, I think that's the first step. That was sort of my toe in the water of thinking that there's more to this than what I experience or how I interpret my experience. The next thing was, I was very anti-church at that time. I had very bad experiences when I was quite young. It was a very evangelical, anyway, Foursquare Church of Los Angeles, if InnerView in the business of knowing the history of churches. So when we got married, Jean went out and sort of interviewed the churches around Cambridge. I was at Harvard at that point. And she found the church that she thought that maybe she could get me to go to. Maybe. And that was the Unitarian Universalist Church of Cambridge. And so I did. I went there on a Sunday, and I loved it. I thought, this is the place. Okay, so that was 52 years ago, and we are still Unitarian Universalists, and we attend the fellowship down in San Luis Obispo. And that was the second step because Unitarian Universalists just are very open. The Unitarians, it's kind of a joke, but it's Unitarians are those who believe in one God at most. And so it was a very open system. By the way, I had to comment on Carolyn. Are you on a bus or a metro? I mean, I got to hand it to you. That is really dedication to sit there and stand up, because I can tell you're not sitting, you're standing up, you're bouncing around. No, I think that's so cool. Anyway, well, welcome aboard. And then we moved to Beirut, Lebanon, when I got after my PhD and a postdoc to teach chemistry at the American University of Beirut. So here was another place where people had a really different way of thinking about the world. And Lebanon, unfortunately, and as you probably know, is sort of a hotbed of all kinds of difficulties. And when we were there, it was the 1960 to 1965. Yeah. Is that right? Or 70 to 75, sorry, 70 to 75. Anyway, that was just before the war started there, and there was troubled times. There were times when we had jet planes strafing overhead. We were down in the basement. We went out to do a little touristing in the central valley of Lebanon called the Bekaa Valley, where there is a building that was little over 2,000 years old, put up during that time, and an Israeli jet flew over our heads. I don't know how fast it was going, 500 miles an hour, about 50 feet above, zoom, and it was making a bombing run on soldiers in Syria. So that was an odd place to be for an American family. Our two children were with us, Boom, the jet goes by. So even though it was my only real introduction, and that was not the only time, there was troubles all the time, bombs and things going off at night. So it was a different place, and there were many different cultures there, Arabs from different countries. And I learned Arabic, which was a big deal for an American professor there. And that was something that really struck me, is that to understand other people, you have to know the language. And I learned that a couple of times, but certainly one of them there was in Arabic, because Americans just simply didn't learn Arabic. I mean, Americans lived there teaching chemistry, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, and just didn't learn it because they didn't have to. Everything was in English. I mean, all the lectures were in English, and the students spoke English quite well, and French. But I think because I'd done that 1 year in France and in Germany, I knew that if I didn't learn something, if I didn't make an effort to learn Arabic, I was going to miss something in my years there. And anyway, coming back from that again, that was sort of I don't know whether I'm on my second or my third step, but basically what I'm saying is I had learned that there's something more to cultural understanding and cultural truth than my cultural understanding, my American cultural understanding. Not that my American cultural understanding was wrong, it just was one way to understand the world. So when I read, so then my wife and I were in an organization called Beyond War with a group in around Washington, D.C. And we were activists trying to convince people, as well as our government representatives, that war, given the nuclear armaments that we and the nasty old Soviets had, it's just inevitable that we will have a nuclear war if we kept testing the limits of who's going to blink first. It's interesting. That was 30 years ago, and we're back to that again now, which is anyway. So as part of that, we decided to ask this sister, the Dominican sister, Miriam McGillis, who was the founder of Genesis Farm and who had established a retreat center there in northwestern New Jersey, where it's still the Garden State. It's very beautiful there. And so we asked her to come down and give a talk at the Northern Virginia Wildlife Federation, and then afterwards all day at our home in Northern Virginia, in Reston. And so she did that. And to prepare for her coming down, we read Dream of the Earth. That was our reading assignment. We being the Beyond War group of about 10 or 12 people who lived in that area. So we met and we read the book and we discussed it. And I found the book very, very powerful and sort of put together my things I hadn't really thought about, but this part of trying to understand or understanding that I had a particular viewpoint that wasn't, the total reality. He being a cultural historian, Thomas knew how to phrase that. And he's a poet. He just writes, his writings were just so beautiful. So then we started going up, my wife and I, Jean, started going up to Genesis Farm, which was only a couple hours up north from where we lived. And we, then that was 1990 or so, 1992. So since then, we've been associated with Genesis Farm off and on until a few years ago when it sort of retired from being a retreat center and other places, but it was all about the universe story as a context. Actually, the universe story, what I learned was we have a new creation story, the universe story, but we don't have a corresponding culture. We haven't developed a culture consistent with it. So we don't have a context in which life can function in a meaningful manner for many of us. And also, we have a very strange situation in that normally the culture, the cosmology, the worldview, and the creation story of a people are all consistent. They're all sort of the same thing. As a matter of fact, many people use the word cosmology to refer to the origin story, the creation story, and the culture, and the worldview, and just kind of wrap them all up, because they always have been all wrapped up. But today, you can't wrap them up anymore, because we have a very well-established creation story, the universe story, which has been discovered, not invented. It's been discovered by humans, and that has happened in a culture which has another creation story, which was not discovered. It was invented, as essentially all creation stories have been. So that, to me, so I understood why it was so hard for the universe story to become mainstream, because it's not, it hasn't been part of the culture. It implies something very different in terms of what would establish a context in which life can function in a meaningful manner. So that's where we are. So I'm not sure when I worked all that out. It took a while just to kind of get it, because it was so odd or different than what I was used to. But effectively, that's been what I've been trying to do, is to just present the universe story so that it sounds interesting. When I first started doing that, it wasn't as interesting as it was later.
Yeah.
I hadn't learned all the little ways to make something pretty much that's almost a science lecture, to turn it into something that's interesting. Anyway, so that's how I got to where I started at Genesis Farm and University of Creation and Spirituality and other places in Wicklow. Okay, that's
it.
That's it.
It's emergent. What your story reminds me is that as the scientist you are, you integrated and let it, stew, if you will, and then made it yours, and it continues to emerge. And I guess the other thing that really is clear in our conversation last week and today is that meaning making has been an essential part of your life. Is that not true?
It's true, and it's also been an essential part of your life. As
Yes.
Thomas Berry says, as in many places, we are the meaning-making species. We make meaning. As a matter of fact, if you have a fairly loose understanding of what meaning is, every living creature makes meaning of its environment. Even a single-celled protozoa makes meaning in letting in certain chemicals through its cell wall and not letting through other chemicals through its cell wall. The chemicals that it lives in its watery environment, they have meaning to that single-celled creature. So it has been part of life for 4 billion years. Creatures making meaning of the environment, and we have inherited that. We put it to a very sophisticated level, but we still we cannot live without meaning. That's insanity. And so, but doesn't mean, the trick is that the meaning that we extract or that we've taught, basically, that's our culture. Culture is what makes meaning. That's the context in which life can function in a meaningful manner. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be meaningful. There's a big difference between being true, whatever that means, and being meaningful. It sufficed if a worldview, a culture, had established its norms and provided a context in which life can function in a meaningful manner. That was sufficient. Until there became 7 billion people on the planet. Then, on the way to that, from 100 million a few centuries ago, well, 1,000 years ago, that which could provide a meaningful living in the past began to break down through communication with other cultures. You know, it's very hard to interpret other cultures, that what they place as menial. Like when I went to France, I had trouble thinking of, understanding why the French thought such and such was meaningful, and I didn't think it was meaningful. So but you put that on a global scale, cultural here, cultures or nations, that's hard. And that's because that the meaning system, the culture, the cosmology, are different. But as long as they provided that meaning for those people, they survived. So,
Larry, going off script just a bit, I'm wondering how. I have to go get a dog, so I'll step away. But I'd love to hear, how have your children taken the universe story and made it theirs?
well, that's embarrassing.
I have children too. I understand.
Well, our daughter is a physician, a family doc, osteopath in private practice, and she was, she's 50 years old now. It's hard to believe, actually, but anyway, she is. And let's see, it was 30, well, I don't know. So she was a teenager, I guess, or 10 or 12 years old. She was a teenager when anyway, so she's 20 years old, or 18 or 20 years old when Jean and I met Miriam. I'd have to calculate exactly when it was, but so she had not been in the universe story part of it. She had grown up in Lebanon, so she was, but that was hard for her because there was a war going on, and she experienced feeling unsafe. When a bomb goes off at night, 500 feet away, you get the jitters a little bit, and that did happen on many occasions. So she understands it. She agrees, because she is a chemist. When she was a chemistry major to be pre-med, but she needs to work on it a little bit. But it's part of her life. She knows, and she knows evolution because she took a lot of biology classes. But her orientation wasn't in that direction. So anyway,
she did focus on meaning making, I would guess.
Oh yeah, she's yeah, and it's hard to say. And then we have 2 granddaughters. They're just about to exit the teenage years, and so I'm hoping that they settle down and do a little more meaning making than they've been doing lately. They probably don't agree with me on that. But anyway, so that's I can't claim any great inheritance of this. But heck, I didn't get it until I was 40 or 45. So I guess maybe that'll happen.
Thank you. I was intrigued, and you didn't say a lot about this, but you said that biologists now are no longer using the tree of life, but a bush. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, and that's not because of any president either.
I'm sure.
What it is, okay, let's go back to our culture. Our culture, the Western culture, has, or our cosmology, our worldview, has some basic assumptions. And this is, from my point of view, the fundamental problem with the entire world today, with all humans today, is the assumptions that are built into a cosmology. The ones in the Western world, we who hold the power, they have assumed, coming right from the Genesis story, that humans are the purpose of Earth, that Earth was created for humans. So right up front. And so the evolutionary biologists of the last century, growing up in this culture, just like I did, just like you did, that assumption is everywhere. It's not just something that someone writes down and says, here's an assumption of our cosmology. It's just embedded in everything we do. And when I was in Ireland one time, I was giving I would give sometimes one evening. I had a 5-day, just like at UCS, a 5-day seminar. I would do that at the this Wicklow community center for the Dominicans there. But also, I went around Ireland giving talks sponsored by sisters, mostly Dominicans. And so anyway, so I was doing this one at a pub, which is basically the social center of a small village. And I was talking about how the humans are the center, basically the center. I think Brian Swimme said this one time that we assume that the human is the center stage act of the play of life, and all the other creatures are the backdrop for the center. So I made this statement, something like that, and this one woman in the audience spoke and said, now she was probably 70 years old at the time, 75, and she was talking about something that happened when she was a little girl. So that was 60 years previous. So this is something that happened maybe in the early mid-1900s, early 1900s, let's say. Her father wanted to build a home on this plot of land, and so before starting, he went out and made a cairn. You know, when you pile stones together, make it kind of a triangular shape. And he put that in the middle of the property, and then went home. And then next morning came back and checked to see if the cairn was still there, and it was untouched. So he proceeded to start building the home. And what she told me is, she said that if the cairn had been moved or knocked down, he would not have built on that property, because that would mean that the she, the creatures who live under the ground, the banshee is the famous she that we probably all know about. There's a whole bunch of she's. She is not feminine, it's S-H-E-E. There's a whole mythology of the she who live on the ground during the day and come up at night. Anyway, it would mean that that was one of their walkways, that property. That's one of the places they use, and therefore humans couldn't build on it because it belonged to them. Now, I thought, holy mackerel, here I am. I had assumed that this human dominant for the Western world was was part of our culture for a long time, hundreds of years, hundreds and hundreds of years, I figured. I just assumed that because it's so evident today. But here she was telling me that an Irish family in the early 1900s were asking permission of the creatures of the land for permission to build a home. Now just compare that to how we ask for permission. We go to our county assessor or the county tax person and get a permit to, build on the land and check out the environmental impact or something. It's all asking humans for permissions to do something to the earth. Okay, that is the only reason and there are many cultures who throughout history who would not do that. I mean, this is the Western approach. Well, when you think about it, it's pretty crazy, isn't it? That we humans can think we can just do anything we want with whatever, the land. But who questions that? I mean, once in a while you might think about it, but it's so deeply built into the assumptions of our worldview that it's very hard to even think about. I mean, what would happen to New York City if we would ask all the squirrels and the birds and the critters living there if it was okay if we could build on it? But other cultures have done that and still do. As a matter of fact, Miriam McGillis at Genesis Farm did that. When she went to build a straw bale home, she asked the creatures. I was with her in that little ceremony, and by golly, they said no. I couldn't hear it, but Miriam got it, and so she didn't build it there. She built it in a different place. So when we have that as our basis, Carolyn, are you on a different bus now? This is really interesting. She's on a voyage here.
I am.
She's the driver now. Oops.
This is okay. I missed that. I saw you walking, but now, you're driving. That's okay. It's a good example of public transportation.
So the Bush idea is that all creatures have a place on Earth, Gaia.
Thomas is such a beautiful writer. When asked this question by a legal person, a person who's a lawyer, and she's established a part of a Florida Institute of Florida International University. She has a graduate program there in legal earth law, I think it's called, or earth jurisprudence. What's the word for
jurisprudence?
Jurisprudence, yes. Anyway, he wrote the kind of the mission or something of that institute, and he says, rights originate where existence originates. And to me, that's another one of Thomas's just way in a few words encapsulates so much meaning. Rights originate where existence originates. So the answer is yes to your question, that every creature on earth has a right to be that creature. Now back to the bush. So when evolutionary biologists or biological historians put out books, even 50 or 60 years ago, even up to that time, they were in this assumption that we all have, that the earth was for humans. And so their assumption was that it started out with single-celled creatures, and now they're humans. So there's this ascendance up to humans. And so you'd see pictures in the books. I mean, I've seen, they're famous pictures of little, slime mold, and then something, and fish and alligators, and then monkeys and Neanderthal, and then us, Homo sapiens, standing nice and erect. And then that's the end. So everybody had the assumption that the purpose, the 4 billion years, even when, after it's been recognized as 4 billion years, that process was a process of always increasing complexity, which, by the way, is not true. Increasing intelligence, which is not necessarily true. A whole bunch of increasings, and starting simple and ending up with us. It's complete now. Earth is complete. Earth has achieved her mission in the cosmic scheme of things. It's very powerful, and it's not so hard. It's not so easy to ferret out unless you consciously think about it. But over the last 15 years or so, the evolutionary biologists have realized that that does not match the evidence, which is why I'm so happy I'm a scientist, because we get trained to look at what actually goes on and not what we think should go on or might go on, or we don't get to make assumptions about what happens or why things happen. You have to go out and test it and see, check it out. So the understanding based on evolutionary understanding of genetic changes, every creature living on Earth today is equally evolved. Every creature, including the little teensy bacteria, has had ancestors that go back 4 billion years, just like we do. There is no viable distinction in quality, or I don't know what adjectives you'd use. In any case, we're all in this together. We all come from the same common ancestor 4 billion years ago. Our great mother was one single cell, and she begat all of us, every living creature on Earth today. And we've all gone through the same set of ancestors, but the ones that made it carried on, had progeny. The ones that didn't make it dropped out. And here we all are today. So the way you represent that is a bush. Starting in the center, that's the great-grandmother. And you go out with all these branches, and those are the kingdoms and the phyla and the genera and finally species, all out like this. Kind of hard to do this on a little tiny square. Anyway, but anyway you go in the bush, placed out there, that creature has had 4 billion years of evolution back to the great mother. And there's no meaningful way to say that one creature is more evolved than another. Now that's using the word evolution properly. If you want to say evolved means having a bigger brain or better thinking powers, then that's something else. And conscious, the word, sometimes that is used for evolution, but that's a different use of the word.
Larry, that's a great stopping point for this portion of the interview. And it encapsulates a worldview shift for me. So I thank you for that. I will take that from this afternoon. And this is the point where I turn it over to Gail, who will be coordinating any comments that people have been listening have. Oh, now Carolyn is up to something new.
Is she going to take a shower?
Oh, there's a bicycle. There's a bicycle back in the back. She didn't use it.
Oh.
I'm home.
Great. All right.
Way to do it.
Thank you, Larry.
Well, thank you, Larry, and thank you, Penny. That was fascinating. And I imagine there are other questions that some of you may have after hearing what Dr. Edwards has been sharing with us. Are there any that have come to mind? Kathy, you had a question maybe about autopoiesis, is that right? I have everybody off mute. No, Penny's still on mute. Why are you still on mute? You have to do it. You have to do it. There you go. All right. Okay. Some people have. Okay. Well, I'll start with my question then. And no, Kathy. Okay. Kathy was saying, I was comparing meaning for all with autopoiesis as being meaning for all. So let's start there with what Kathy has talked about meaning, finding meaning. Any surprises anybody had in experiencing this, what Larry told us, or perhaps in your own experiences traveling around the world to other cultures and finding that they are working from a totally different meaning base than yourself? Anybody remember that?
That brings to mind experience I had as a junior in high school. I was a foreign exchange student to Taiwan. And I learned Chinese, and one of the things I realized after that year was how differently I was thinking when I got home, and how much acquiring a new language actually changed the process of my thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It occurred to me while you're talking, Dr. Edwards, that that now we have that different meaning making right here in our own country. It isn't so much the American thought as it was back in the 60s and 70s, but now not only we have a lot of different cultures that are living close, more in closer quarters, but we also have different religious views and different stories coming up. So as things are evolving in our minds, then of course we have the conservative, the liberal, and the off the charts of each different religious tradition usually. And so within religions, we have disparity of agreement about meaning, but then we also have much more plurality than we've ever had before. And how do you advise us to work through that in a way that's good for us? The whole culture. I can't say culture, can I? I have to say the whole community.
That represents a challenge, because the original cosmology here that we brought in from Europe and developed over the last 300, 400 years is very xenophobic or racist. So, and that's built in, and so we all struggle with that when we recognize it. It's one of the assumptions of our culture that we've known about, but that's a good example of something. Even though you know it, you still have trouble actually living without it or excluding it. But let's go even more. The ones I'm interested in is there was a legal case came up 6 months ago or so, or 8 months ago, and a judge allowed legal representation, a lawyer, to represent a river, and the river was suing somebody for polluting. Now we're getting somewhere. Now we're saying that not only are humans, created with rights, and that's been a struggle of different races or backgrounds. A race isn't a very good word, actually, but I don't know what other word to use. But now we're saying rivers. And I believe, I'm not mistaken, a mountain was given. Oh, and a dog. That's right. Just in a recent divorce case, I don't think it's been agreed. I haven't, but I read it just a month ago. The judge, they as part of the breakup, they were asking what would become of the dog. And if a dog is a thing, then it belongs to the person who purchased the dog. But if a dog is a human, actually I think that's the word they were using, giving the dog, the consideration was, does the dog have human rights? Then the judge must take into consideration what is best for the dog. Go with the husband or the wife. So a river and a dog, that's a huge extension of our understanding of who gets rights, or what is what was the world created for, who has a right to exist here. Anyway, that's maybe not very far. There are many cultures that have had a much better understanding of who has rights and who belongs here, or which creatures. The downside of one of those things is giving corporations human. Maybe you might take that in a good way and say, well, at least it's not a human being human, but it's kind of odd. So I don't know if the dog case is going to be an odd thing or if it's going to represent something that's really important.
Yeah, I'm not sure the corporation being seen as the person is an extension of a cosmology or an origin story, except for the same one we've always been living, taking it to its ultimate conclusion. That's what I'm seeing that.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Well, what do you say in these last, you said you have 25% of your life left. I hope at least 50% left. So you can continue teaching us. What do you think with this new internet age now? My language changes, everybody's language has changed, but there's a way of thinking that has changed, like Carolyn was talking about. And now as we become, the computer becomes an extension of our mind and our culture and our sociability. How do you see, is there any hope that this might become a good thing for us in opening up?
Obviously, I don't know, but that won't stop me from giving an opinion. It could be a very good thing, obviously. I mean, it has been a very good thing. We have social media. Look at the thing going on right now with the women, men attitude toward women, attitude and actions toward women over the last couple thousand years. But that hit social media because some women stood up and they said they had enough, and suddenly it's going like wildfire. So you got to say that's a good thing. And reporting of atrocities in countries, or even getting assistance for when there's an earthquake or something, all that technology is there, and that's obviously helpful. The downside, and it has actually, there was an article just not too long ago about the effect of social media on teenagers, and it's negative. Mm-hmm. This article concluded, the author of the article. I think the bigger question, a question that is part of this, what are we going to do with 10 billion people on the planet? How are they going to communicate? You might say, okay, we don't need the internet. We can go back and just live the way we lived a few hundred years ago, 1,000 years ago. Actually, that's the way I'm living now. I live in a co-housing community, and there are 36 units here, and we're clustered. And because we clustered the land, we left 10 acres of oaks. I'm staring out the window right now at the blue oaks of Paso Robles. Paso Robles means the way of the oaks. And these are the indigenous oaks of this region. And we signed, the people who formed it, said that we can't cut those oaks down. So we built on 4 acres instead of 14 acres, and we live all together. And so that's the idea was that's the way we lived in small villages, and it was effective. But you can't do that with 10 billion people, especially with climate change causing refugees, millions of refugees in the next century. So I don't know. I think my guess is that we're into the internet. It's going to continue, and I suspect that fairly soon we'll start having studies that are government-wide, UNESCO-wide, on what is the overall effect on our health, mental health. So I don't know. It's kind of a wait-and-see situation. I'm not really that big on the internet. I mean, I think I was a little too old when it came in. we'll see.
Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Oh, please. Yes.
About the different eras of the Earth, and what we're going to be leaving and going into a new era. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, if that's pertinent.
Are you talking about the era of the human, what's it called, the Anthropocene? Or you mean the eras in general?
In general, yeah, well, yes, in general, sort of, where we're going.
Okay, the latest era, geological type era, is we're at the end of a 2.5 million year. Well, not the end necessarily. We're at the 2.5 million years, and in the last 2.5 million years, it's called the Holocene, I think. Anyway, I never got those names straight, but we've had a cold of time of about 90 to 100,000 years, and then a warming cycle of warming time of about 10,000 years. So it's been cycles, periods about 100,000 years roughly. There's been about 20, 25 of them over the last 2.5 million years. And we're now at the end of the 10,000 year warming cycle. And what's supposed to happen, if we didn't have global warming, we would be going into an ice age right now. And that would be normal. That was brought to me very clearly at Genesis Farm, because Genesis Farm in New Jersey, northern New Jersey, just happened to be at a place where the glacier coming down and about 10,000 years ago stopped. And when it stopped, it dropped all these huge rocks that it had been carrying, as well as a lot of good soil. And so you have a particular kind of soil right there in New Jersey, 20 feet deep of good topsoil, this one place, right, not very far from Genesis Farm. So that was a really interesting part. I kind of knew that, but I never really knew it until I actually experienced it. I actually walked to it. So we should be going into an ice age now. That would be the next, and it would last for about 90 to 100,000 years. But we're not going to do that probably. And so nobody knows what that means. We're messing around, we're messing around with some very big changes in the way Earth has functioned. But the real age that they're calling now the Anthropocene, means the human age, is the age where the major effect on everything on the Earth is the human. And what that really means is that a million years from now, when the archaeologists or the geologists are digging in the ground and going back to figure out what happened a million years ago, they will find something in the strata of the layers of the Earth that say, this is the start of when humans were the major effect on Earth. And then maybe it'll be something that says, this is when humans disappeared. Just like seeing the iridium, let's say, line of 66 million years ago, when they say, that's when the big strike by the asteroid took out the dinosaurs. So they can say that happened. So that's been what the geologists want a marker in the soil that says this transition from this to this. And so there have things that humans have done. Plastics, that's one of them. Plastics will be around for the next probably million years. And they'll look back here and they'll see all these new plastics that weren't here 20 years ago, but are here now. They'll be buried at a certain level and they'll say, that's the start of the Anthropocene. So that would be the modern era in geological terms, the era when the humans are the major factor in terms of what's deposited, what's left for the future to see. And what would that be like? I don't know. It's the same question of you all know about the plastics in the oceans. I don't know if I just don't know. But it's not the possibilities. Not too many of them are good possibilities. But as Thomas Berry used to say, well, you know, when asked if humans had a future, he'd say, in this typical way, he'd turn his head like this and say, well, maybe 3% probability of surviving. But would you change? Would you stop working on it? And if that were true? He said it much more eloquently than that. He said everything very eloquently. No, everything seems, things are, there are, even with a good president and a good Congress and so on, which we haven't had, well, we haven't, anyway, there are factors, there are things going on, there are changes in the earth that may be irreversible, and so we have to adjust to a different ecosystem to live in, and it certainly will not be able to handle 10 billion people. That's for sure. And the only known, you'll be happy to know out there, since most of you are women, the only known effective institution or institutional response is to put the women in power. Educate women and put them in positions of decision making. That's the only successful way to reduce the birth rate. The only known. Maybe that'll do it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah. Ask something I can answer positively. You know?
Yeah.
Like Santa Claus or something.
What? Oh, somebody have a question? Marianne, you're on mute. I'm going to unmute you. Let's not both do it. Okay, Marianne.
Yeah. Hi, Larry.
Hi, Marianne. Good to see you again.
Yeah, you too. Just wondering what teaching you're doing now. I believe you taught a course for the Fox Institute.
Right.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it looked just like a lot like the course that you did, the seminar you did a long time ago. The Fox Institute of Creation Spirituality in Boulder is really a nice place. It's not quite done yet, but it will probably be in a month or so. They're still, putting some landscaping in and that kind of stuff. And the format is the same as it was in Oakland. Body prayer, 3 hours for the seminar, art is meditation, group process group. I always thought that was the best pedagogy I'd ever seen. And 5-day seminars. And so mine was the second one. The first one was about Mary Magdalene, starting off with the winter. And then mine, but everything was just barely starting off in terms of number of people, because, startups are tough. So, but it had been about maybe 7 years since I'd done that seminar. So now don't tell anybody this, but I was really scared when I started that. Because it just been so long, and I went over my notes. First off, I had to find my notes. They were buried back on my hard drive somewhere. And I thought, oh my gosh, I used to just, I'd done that 5-day seminar so many times. I don't know, 50 times maybe. Because I did it in Wicklow, Ireland, twice a year for 10 years or so. But in 7 years, so much kind of flies away. Anyway, it was fun. It was good. I got back in the groove, and I had a lot of fun, and everybody seemed to be okay. And I pretty much did the same thing, updated. Everything, of course, was updated with the latest knowledge that I had. But again, the actual facts weren't, of the story weren't the central issue. There was a story, and the story is based on evidence. And luckily, it's a very beautiful story. It's a very inspiring story. it could have been a dud. Nobody knew what the history of the universe was going to be when we all went out, looking for the Big Bang and stuff. Could have been several Big Bangs. Nobody knew, right? But it turns out to be this wonderful, really cool story, and with giving insight into how these creatures, for me anyhow, it's given me a much greater appreciation for the diversity of life on Earth, and for the importance of the interaction between life and non-life. I don't think that would not have occurred to me if I hadn't actually gone back and studied it, which I did. So anyway, so it was a wonderful experience for me. I loved it. And we had a little snow in Boulder. And I realized the first time I'd seen snow in probably 20 years. Living here in California, I've been seeing snow falling, actually coming down from where it comes from. So it was fun. I enjoyed it, and I think everybody did.
Well, I hope you do more of it, because it's certainly that course was certainly a life changer for me.
Oh, how so? Tell me, Mary.
To realize that there was a story that's big enough and true enough that everybody on Earth can believe it. Gives us all a story to share, and the other thing was to realize that as a human, I'm part of the heart and mind of the universe. Gave me a kind of a reason to be, which I was looking for. Yeah.
Yeah. Who am I?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Plus the doctoral thesis that you guided me with, turned out I offered it 7 times. The course that I designed at the college that I taught at. I'm retired now, but it had a lot of influence further. So your course echoed on with the next generation.
Wonderful.
Let's do just a little show of hands in the old school way. How many of us listening today had their lives changed and their universe story, their sense of creation changed by their studies with Dr. Edwards? Anybody besides me? Yes. Yeah. You touched us all in so many ways. It's such an important story to hear. And I loved it because it was true. And I was a minister, I'm a theologian, and I found in my sense of my tradition, I found nothing to argue with what I'd already come to believe, and I found that very powerful then to have the universe confirm what we had kind of like intuited all this time. But so I thank you. What are you planning to do with your last, again, 25% of? What are you going to focus on? What are you dedicated now? How are you dedicated?
Well, I thought skydiving would be really the way to go.
Okay, well, that might shorten those 25%. Yeah.
No, well, I'm going to, if the Fox Institute of Creation and Spirituality goes, which it looks like it seemed like that will happen. I'll be going there every 6 months to. Which is what I did at the UCS way back then. I think I did the seminar every 6 months. And then here, I'm a member of a group called the Citizens Climate Lobby, working on the climate business with not very successfully here, but anyway, trying to get a price on carbon. That's actually what's involved. That's a very simple solution to a very complex problem. Just put a price on carbon and then let it float from there. Actually, the oil companies want to do that so they can know what the heck's going on instead of being bannered and bashed around by this Congress and that Congress, and stability is very important. So and then of course surviving all this co-housing business is a challenge. It's just a different way of living that requires is a bit of a challenge for, for an introvert like me, but it's been good for me.
Wow. Well, thank you. You shared a lot with us and given us some wonderful ideas and ways to relook at our world. I would imagine as we turn off our computers here, am I going to think about the story and how much we need to have a story that is that we all can share and that has some basis in who we are now, which is learned. We have people who study. We have people who we are able now to study the origins of the universe. That's an amazing thing to have come to. So then we can go back and look at it and make meaning out of it. So you've inspired me to think about that more and share it more and lift it up more. Is there any questions that anybody has burning that they would like to offer before we close? Well, we would just like to thank you, Dr. Edwards and Penny, for a wonderful interview and for your time and your dedication to Earth and its peoples over your whole life, and particularly this last half of your life. You've been a gift to many, including us.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. You've all been a gift to me, too. Everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Blessings. Namaste.
Thank you.